Again, these pictures are raw coming in. We were getting all of this live about an hour or so ago from a different camera from Martin Savage. He has two cameramen with him. These pictures are just coming in as we speak. But again, that RPG, that rocket-propelled grenade, did not, as far as we know, hit any Marines, but they are responding with a lot of caution, very understandably.
And another interesting point about the people standing around these empty Iraqi tanks, apparently they were in jogging suits. They looked like civilians. They had their hands up, but then that rocket-propelled grenade came at the Marines and they opened fire. As far as we know, though, no casualties as a result of that particular round of fire.
And again, this is just one of the things that the Marines at this unit is doing. Their mission, at least in this hour of this day, identify these Iraqi tanks, Iraqi fighting vehicles, destroy whatever they come across, and they are doing that very efficiently in this video. Let's watch what's going to happen to this tank. Just saw a Marine jumping off it, assuming he put some sort of ordnance inside. I guess not. Again, this video all coming in raw, so you are seeing it as we are seeing it.
Yeah, and all the while Martin Savage had to keep moving because the Marines had opened fire. They didn't exactly know what was coming from the other side. And I believe that they were only fired on that one time by the rocket-propelled grenade.
Right. It was sort of a chaotic scene, and Martin Savage was reporting live all throughout it. There were shots going off. Hard to tell exactly what of it was Marines destroying other pieces of equipment. In fact, we just saw about a minute or so ago a Marine with a .50 caliber machine gun shooting into a truck that had been abandoned, disabling that truck so that it couldn't be used in any future time.
And again, there's a small town nearby, and people were actually in the homes. In fact, they were out on the streets, kind of applauding the U.S. military presence. And then, as things started to develop, they sort of faded away into their homes and took cover for obvious reasons.
And initially it was sort of confused, as it often is on a battlefield, not sure where the fire was coming from, where that RPG came from. What it was later learned, and what Martin learned and told us live, was that the RPG actually came from within the town. So again, it made it a very difficult situation to identify.
And has Martin moved on now? Because I know British tanks had come in to secure the area, and Martin and the Marines have moved along.
That's right, they have moved along.
We want to go to Walter Rogers now in southern Iraq with the 7th Cavalry. At last check, they were still stopped. Are they still? It looks like they are. Walter?
Hello, Carol. I think the lead of the story, the military lead of the story all across the southern theater in Iraq, from where Martin Savage is in southeastern Iraq to where we are in south central Iraq, the lead of the story is that the Iraqis are not rolling over and playing dead despite overwhelming American military power. They are putting up at least nuisance resistance. That's what we've seen with the 3rd Squadron of the 7th U.S. Cavalry. They have been bogged down on this road for a number of hours now, because earlier in the day it was determined there was a detachment of Iraqi soldiers several miles up the road, and it was not clear how large the detachment was. It wasn't even clear the intentions of the detachment. Then the Iraqis began firing mortars at the Crazy Horse troop of the 7th Cavalry. That suggested very clearly to the commanders here that those Iraqis were going to stand and fight, even though they were overwhelmingly outnumbered by the United States. The Americans began firing 155 millimeter Paladin shells, laying these great arrays of artillery out there. Still, the Iraqi soldiers did not cut and run. Next thing, the Army sent in its helicopters. They began shooting at whatever remained after the artillery barrage, and more than a few Iraqi soldiers, the dismounts, were killed in the artillery barrage, but the others did not run. The Iraqi soldiers held their ground. What they did was stand and fight, and when the helicopters came over, the U.S. Army's Kiowa reconnaissance helicopters, the helicopters came under fire from these determined Iraqi troops. shoulder-fired missiles were fired at the Kiowas, also some 50 caliber machine guns. The pilots of the Kiowas, 7th Cavalry, had to fly very nimbly, ducking and dodging to get out of the way. Still, the Iraqi soldiers did not cut and run. Then the Army called in a little help from the Air Force. The Air Force flew in its A-10 Warthog, which carries tremendous firepower, has a huge Gatling gun in the front that just tears up the ground in front of anything before it. The A-10 made passes over the ground. Apparently, the Iraqi threat, the detachment which was up the road, again, we don't know the size of that Iraqi detachment. They have been pretty well wiped out, according to the Army commanders here, Apache troop of the 7th Cavalry. But again, the Army is waiting just a little longer. It appears, however, that the threat has been eliminated at this point. It took longer than expected. The reason I conclude the threat's been eliminated is because suddenly we see refueling tanks coming up to refuel the tanks that were parked beside the road. That suggests that they wouldn't bring refueling tanks if there was a danger of artillery fire coming in. So the 7th Cavalry should start rolling northward on this road behind me very soon. But they were detained longer than expected. No U.S. casualties at all, no U.S. vehicles injured, but it does prove that even though the Iraqis are a weak force, badly outnumbered, they can be a nuisance. Back to you.
Yeah, Walter, I was just going to ask you, this isn't the Republican Guard we're talking about. This is the Army that's supposedly disorganized, so this must have come as kind of a surprise to the U.S. military there.
I think it did. I wouldn't overrate what we saw today. What we're seeing is essentially a nuisance factor. If the Army decided to punch through with the tanks, the armored columns, they could obliterate anything there. The problem, of course, in doing that is that you take risks with your men and you take risks with your tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles you don't want to take at this point of the campaign because the Army is still a long way south of Baghdad. And the time to take the risks is when you get closer to Baghdad and when you encounter the very serious units, the Republican Guard units, which will be defending the southern gates of Baghdad. Again, the Iraqis are showing that they can and will make a fight, albeit a nuisance factor. The Army could have punched through, but the decision, and probably the prudent decision, was to do a standoff fight, keep the tanks, the soldiers here present at this time, and then fire the long-range artillery at them, then bring in the helicopters, use the helicopters' weapons against them, and when they still didn't complete it, they called in the A-10 Warthog, that old stalwart of anti-tank fights from before. No evidence the Iraqis had a tank up there, but they did have some very committed soldiers with anti-aircraft weapons. Back to you, Carol.
Walter Rogers reporting live from